Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to More Bugs and More Places. I appreciate the difficulty many of you may have had attending such an early talk given the parties last evening. Sorry. I appreciate the difficulty many of you may have gone through attending an early talk given the parties last evening. Let's start off with an introduction. My name is David Kane-Parry. I'm a principal security analyst with the Leviathan Security Group. I'm not going to give you the elevator pitch, but if you're interested in what we do, you can find out more information about us at leviathansecurity.com. I'm also going to be a Hacker Court expert witness. So if you're interested in the technological and legal issues surrounding criminal wiretapping, you'll want to check out the Hacker Court later on at 3:15. I don't remember which room it's in now. So I know there are many here that spend all day long thinking very deep thoughts about security, but there are many more every day where security is just one of their responsibilities in their day-to-day jobs. And so I think before we start talking about mobile security, we need a little background here on reflections on trusting trust. If you're already aware of the paper, then that's good. We're just going to try and cover this quickly for the folks who may not be aware. Back in 1983, Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie were awarded the ACM Turing Award for their work in OS theory and their implementation of the Unix operating system. In his acceptance speech, Mr. Thompson described his college day amusement of competing with his friends to design the shortest program possible for self-replicating. That is to say, an application that once compiled and executed would spit out its own source code. He then proceeds to demonstrate how using this principle, it's possible for him to insert a Trojan into the C compiler, such that every time the C compiler detects that it's compiling, say, the login program, they would automatically insert code that would be compiled and insert a backdoor password into the login process. So the moral he goes on to explain is that you can't really trust any code that you haven't actually written yourself entirely, including the compiler or the interpreter that the code is running in. So where does that leave us? Well, we can't just give up on this whole computing thing, so we accept certain risks. And one of those risks is that, well, yes, the SDKs that vendors are shipping aren't really likely to have those kinds of bugs in them. But that doesn't mean that the vendor is the only one who's going to try and ship you the SDK. So how can we trust the SDKs that we're about to install? Well, there are a couple of technologies that help increase the level of trust. You've got SSL and TLS protocols and signed binaries. The SSL and TLS protocols help ensure that you are communicating with the individual you believe you are based on certificates that they provide that you can validate with a third party. The same kind of system is in place with signed binaries. The binaries are provided with a certificate that you can also validate. So you would expect, given that these two technologies are easy to implement, that they would be just about everywhere when it comes to distributing SDKs. But that's not necessarily the case. For the Blackberry SDKs, you're actually in good luck. They use SSL and TLS for distribution, and their binaries are signed with a valid certificate. For the Android platform, they don't use signed binaries. They only use HTTPS. But there's an interesting bug, at least for the SDK distribution that runs on Windows, where they have had the issue often enough that folks can't download the APIs and documentation that their setup program installs via HTTPS and allow the user to just use HTTP instead. Windows Phone and iPhone SDKs, they use signed binaries, but they don't use HTTPS for any of their distribution. So you might be wondering, well, what if there's a bug in the SSL and TLS protocols or in the signed binary distribution? And that might very well be the case, but that's not really within the scope for the talk that I'll be talking about here. So I'd like to make a quick note about Eclipse. Eclipse is the officially supported IDE for both the Blackberry environment and the Android environment. Eclipse itself isn't shipped using any secure protocols or any kind of signed binaries, but the Eclipse plugins themselves may be. You can install plugins via HTTPS. Those plugins can be signed. For Blackberry, Blackberry installs its plugins automatically from its own installation media, but they're not signed. Android will install those plugins using the HTTPS facility, but they're also not signed. And actually, when you're doing this, an error will pop up from Eclipse saying, hey, wait a second, these plugins you're trying to install aren't signed. What do you want to do? If you're happy-go-lucky, you can go ahead and click it, but in general, it's not a great idea to be training your users to dismiss their security warnings. So let's talk about some of the common features that all of these platforms are going to provide developers. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is sandboxing. Sandboxing is a cute way of describing how applications are put into their own directory with their own usernames, and they can do whatever sorts of damage they want to do within that area, but nothing they could do could possibly hurt any other application on the system. If they want to be able to reach outside that sandbox, they're going to have to use the platform-provided APIs. They're going to be very careful about what resources those applications can access. APIs, that are used exclusively for accessing, say, the mobile phone user's photo collection, the mobile phone user's media collection, contacts, so on and so forth. Let's see. Sandboxing is a useful security mechanism in the short term in the event that it prevents you from accidentally compromising another application. But over the long term, we've seen with other sandbox-like technologies that eventually someone will find a way to break out of it. And so when you're developing applications, it's careful to keep in mind that the sandbox is to protect your application, protect other applications from yourself, but not protect your application from the other ones on the system. If you are doing any sort of persistent storage into the file system, you need to be careful to validate that information just as much as if you were in a desktop environment where other applications could just as easily mess with your state. The other common feature that these mobile platforms provide are the ideas of capabilities or permissions. Basically, applications shipping with metadata describing that the privileges that those applications need to work on the phone, separate from any kind of concept on the desktop you have of a regular user versus administrative user, its capabilities and permissions break down more along the lines of, can this application access the internet? Can this application access the camera? So on and so forth. There are a couple of ways these capabilities or permissions are defined. In the Blackberry environment, these capabilities are defined based on the code signatures the application is shipped with. RIM requires a $20 processing fee for applications that want code signatures that allow them to access export-controlled crypto functions, access functions for saving information to the phone. And they say that this is really just for monitoring purposes. They're not doing any kind of actual security review of applications in the process, but then in the event that someone is found to be distributing malware, they can revoke the certificate and the application won't be executed. There's an especially interesting use in Android that we're going to be talking about later, where the capabilities don't extend just out into the system environment, but also between applications and between application subcomponents themselves. These capabilities also exist on the iPhone platform, but they're not developer accessible in the sense that the only capability that isn't provided by default to iPhone applications is to be able to use the location service. Every application can request to use it. The user is required to either accept or deny it. By default, most applications all have the same capabilities there. Apple themselves have the ability to grant additional capabilities to applications that go through the application approval process for the application store. But from the developer side, you don't really get to ask for anything more because there's really not anything more you could ask for. So we've talked about some of the common features that mobile platforms have. Now I'd like to talk about some of the common threats that mobile platforms have. Unique threats for mobile platforms as opposed to the desktop or server environment. The first one that comes to mind is that the issue of doing secure wipes in a mobile environment is difficult to impossible. Mobile storage is primarily based on flash media or secure drives, and those flash or secure drives use wear leveling algorithms to make sure that specific sectors don't get worn out faster than others. Unlike your typical storage media where you can read and write a 1 and 0 to a specific sector over and over again and not necessarily degrade the quality of the media, with flash or SD, if you tried to do that over and over again, the entire media would become unusable very quickly. So these wear leveling algorithms ensure that over time, no one sector becomes more used than any other. It makes it difficult to do secure file deletion in that case because there's no real way to guarantee that the 1s and 0s you'd like to write to one specific sector will actually occur on that specific sector because the wear leveling algorithm will intercept that. So you have a couple of options if you need to do secure file deletion on mobile platforms. One idea is that if you have the ability in your deployment in the application use case to fill up the entire disk, then you can ensure that when you remove that file and write back to it, that the only sectors left are the sectors you have in mind. That's not going to fly in most cases. So a good general policy to adopt is that if you have information that you're saving to disk that you expect at some point later on is going to be wiped, a safer approach is to make sure that it's stored encrypted. You don't have to worry about not being able to do secure wipes correctly, because in the event that an attacker gets access to the device, the only way they'll have access to the data is if they get access to the key. Another common threat for mobile devices is geolocation. Just about all of these devices come with GPS receivers in them, and/or they try and do triangulation via cell towers, or do guessing via DNS based on the provider that they have access to. So there are a couple of notes to keep in mind when you're using geolocation services. The first one is that depending on the application you're developing, if you consider stuff like the longitude and latitude of the current user as a private information, geocoders typically don't use SSL protocols. You can, for a fee, I believe, get one from Google that will do SSL, but I don't believe that it's natively supported in their API for the Android API. Another note there is that the API keys are based on the MD5 hash of the certificate that you're using to sign your binary. That's not a significantly pervasive threat, but MD5 collisions are known to happen. I don't know who would go through the trouble of doing a collision on your certificate just so they could get your API key, just so they could exhaust the number of requests that your users can make, but it's something you might want to keep in mind. Another issue that comes up is, and we're going to be talking more about how intents are resolved in Android. But if you're using the Android platform, you're dependent on location providers to provide information to you about where the user is. And depending on what other applications are registered on the device, whichever application claims to provide the highest accuracy is going to be the one that you're getting your information from. It may not necessarily be the one that you want it from, and so a certain amount of trust is involved and/or validation of the information you're getting back. And finally, a lot of people don't consider that users may consider location data private, and you should take that into account as far as when this information remains resident in memory, when you're writing it to disk, what is the appropriate level of privacy for this information, because some folks would be rather upset if it were revealed. Another common issue, independent of the platforms, just at a cellular level, is the security importance of the IME and the IMSI. The IMEI is a unique identifier that identifies the specific device on the network. And the IMSI identifies a specific subscriber. Usually it's associated with the SIM card on a GSM device. So a subscriber can take the SIM out of one device, move it into another, and the network still knows this is still, Bob Jones, but he's on a different phone now. You have the ability to request this information from the phone, but they're really so dangerous that you really shouldn't consider saving them. And in the event that your application is required to transfer them in any context, you make sure that that's encrypted. So the last common threat I'm going to talk about here is forensics. Mobile phones, unlike your desktops or laptops, are much more likely to go missing or be stolen. And when it comes to physical security, I think most of us with a security background understand that if you own the device physically, then you can own the device every other way. So designing your application to be resistant to contexts in which there is an attacker who has complete device with the control is something to keep in mind. Some devices are actually better equipped than others to handle situations like this. An attacker who presumes that a remote wipe facility is available on the phone can take steps to make sure that the phone simply won't receive that self-destruct mechanism. I believe earlier versions of Windows Mobile, which I won't be talking about here because Windows Phone is coming up next, but at least in previous versions, and I would expect in the upcoming version, has a facility to have a heartbeat mechanism in the event the phone can't establish a regular interval connection back to some predefined corporate server. It will also self-destruct. So it's a little harder for an attacker to maintain that control, but it's still possible. once the attacker has full control